This is all theater. This is all just political theater.
Political theater. Political theater.
Pure political
theater.
Theater.
Political theater.
The nefarious,
significant and protracted
political theater for political theater's sake.
I yield back.
From Washington, this is Political Theater, Roll Call's review of the spectacle of politics on Capitol Hill and across the country. I'm Jason Dick. It is great to be back podcasting in 2025. We've got a new Congress. They were sworn in last week, and we're in the in-between times, the last days of the Biden administration as we await the January 20th inauguration of Donald Trump. As we record this, the late President Jimmy Carter's remains lie in state in the Capitol Rotunda as part of a state funeral for the 39th president. And we know that we are in for a potentially significant year of legislating, with Republicans in the majority in both the House and Senate, and with Trump as the GOP's White House occupant. So where to start? How about the federal budget? The federal budget, it's often a bone of contention, with politicians often vowing to tame its deficit spending. And in the incoming administration, the so-called Department of Government Efficiency, which is really an advisory commission, it'll be headed up by Elon Musk and Vivek Ramaswamy, and they will aim to recommend how to cut trillions of dollars from the government. This is easier said than done. Just ask the 2011 Super Committee, officially the Joint Select Committee on Deficit Reduction, which had a mandate and a mission to cut the deficit and sign off from the key leaders of a divided government, and failed spectacularly. Here to help us consider the Super Committee and the Doge is our CQ Roll Call budget tracker, David Lerman, also the host of our sister CQ Budget podcast. David, welcome to your first time on Political Theater.
Jason, I host a humble budget podcast. I always considered Political Theater podcast to be way above my pay grade, but I'm happy to be here.
Welcome. And then also welcome to your long-suffering editor, Peter Cohn, CQ Roll Call's managing editor for news, and maybe one of the top 5 people in the world on all things budget. Pete, welcome to Political Theater.
That's definitely not true, but thanks, Jason. It's great to be here as a first-time guest.
So I thought, maybe we'd start this podcast off with a little pop culture reference. This Political Theater, often we try to bill it as the intersection of politics and policy and pop culture. This always seems like an easy task, especially when people who are not as familiar with the levers of government set out about it to cut the federal budget, cut the federal deficit. It just makes me think of one of my favorite movies, which is Moneyball, based on the Michael Lewis book. We've got a little clip that we're going to play right here, and Alan Jasinski, our wonderful producer, will play that clip now.
Hey, listen, no, I appreciate it.
You're welcome.
But the thing is,
you don't know how to play first base. Scott?
That's right.
It's not that hard, Scott. Tell him, Wash.
It's incredibly hard.
Hey, anything worth doing is, and we're going to teach you.
Scott Hatterberg was previously a catcher. He had a reconstructive elbow surgery. This is a real life thing, not just dramatized in Moneyball, the motion picture. Billy Beane, employing sabermetrics and Moneyball tactics, wanted to sign him because he got on base. The only thing is they needed a place for him, and that place was at first base, which he had never played. And simple to say, like, hey, simple to play first base. Tell him, Wash. No, it's not. Just like cutting the federal budget is not that simple either. It is incredibly hard. David, let's start with you. In your capacity as our illustrious budget tracker, you have been following some of the early rumbles of the Department of Government Efficiency. And this seems like they have a big full head of steam. Elon Musk was on the Capitol last month, and he even put one of his children on his shoulders to parade around to show everybody who's boss. They want to cut up to $2 trillion, it seems, which would roughly, collapse between what we take in and what we spend on a given year. Wouldn't make much of a dent in the overall debt, federal debt. But where is the Doge right now? Are they hiring? Are they, taking applications? Are they, what are they doing? Last I heard, Musk was just bothering people in Britain and Germany.
Yeah, well, they're certainly getting a lot of attention for themselves, right? I mean, ever since Trump announced this thing, with a lot of fanfare. They've been, Elon Musk made the rounds on Capitol Hill. He loves to tweet about it. It's an easy way for them to grab the spotlight. But we have no idea yet how effective they're going to be, if they're going to be able to come up with, they can come up with anything they want. They're really just an advisory panel. They call it the Department of Government Efficiency. They're not a department. They have no intrinsic power. Congress has the power of the purse still, even under Trump. And so anything they come up with is going to have presumably bipartisan support. I mean, unless they go this budget reconciliation route with this. And even then, it's hard for me to imagine that they get very far, because the margins are just too slim. And, you can come up with all of the rules you want. You can come up with all of the constructs you want, like this department. At the end of the day, if the political will isn't there and you're not united, it's not going to happen, right? And there's plenty of history to that. There's a long history, as I'm sure Pete can recount poetically, of all of the past commissions that have been put in place to try to rein in federal spending, and they don't get very far. And the reason is it's hard. If it were easy, it would have been done ages ago. The debt keeps mounting. And I don't think the political will is there, really, and the unity is certainly not there. I mean, look, just last week, look how hard it was for the House Republicans to elect a speaker. It took arm-twisting, backdoor phone calls from Trump. I mean, that was too hard. And look at just last month, just to pass a stopgap measure to prevent a shutdown. That was huge ordeal just to do what they absolutely had to do, right?
Bare minimum.
Barely. And this is not a have to do. This is really a want to do. When you talk about slashing federal spending, there's no imperative to do it right now. They may have to do some in order to get the debt limit raised. We can talk about that. But I mean, this is a huge undertaking. I think Trump is just giving Elon Musk and Ramaswamy free rein to sort of come up with whatever they want with. And then it's going to fall in the lap of Congress. And if they're trying to do this through the regular appropriations process, good luck. I just don't see it really happening.
That's a good segue to the top of mind for me, which is for some reason I find myself thinking about the super committee. Pete, we've been covering Congress together for quite a long time, low these 20 plus years now, at places like National Journal and now CQ and Roll Call. But the super committee to me stands out for just how it came about. It came out of, this, we were headed towards a debt ceiling, breach in the summer of 2011. Timothy Geithner, who was President Obama's Treasury Secretary, had said in the spring, hey, we got a couple months left, and then we're going to hit the debt limit. We really need to address this. John Boehner, who was the speaker at the time, and Obama, traded back and forth like what they were billing as a grand bargain that fell apart. And we just kept on creeping closer. In late July, the temperature was getting really hot and gross around DC, and tempers were flaring. And they one of the things that they came up with was, okay, let's do a sort of series of compromises where we raise the debt limit. It would be subject to congressional disapproval. That'll give us some breathing room. And then we're going to have this joint select committee that we're going to pick. We're going to pick really good, serious people to populate it. They're going to have a target of $1.2 trillion in cuts that they have to have 7 people or 6 Republicans, 6 Democrats, from the House and Senate. And, it didn't work. But let's talk about like some of the personnel involved in that and why it didn't work, even when they had this buy-in, even in a time of divided government.
Yeah, well, I mean, first, I think it's important to really kind of draw that bright line between what the DOGE is and what the super committee was. As David pointed out, the DOGE is this sort of unofficial advisory group that's kind of been slapped together. And they're going around highlighting certain things they don't like about the way the federal government operates right now. There's some things that Trump can do on his own, administratively without congressional approval. They can order all federal employees back to work, except those with union contracts. I mean, back to the office, excuse me. They're all working. But, they can come back 5 days a week, and you may see some attrition that way, and which could have some cost savings attached to it. There's some rulemaking they can do at the federal, at the administrative level, sort of unwinding some pricey things that the Biden administration has done. But it's absolutely true. They have no statutory authority. They are not a so-called department. They have no ability to affect cuts on their own. Everything that deals with a federal program has to go through Congress. Essentially, if you're going to cut budgets, if you're going to change the structure of federal agencies, all that's got to go through Congress. So the super committee, segueing to that, was a detailed proposal that came out of it that was attached to the deal to lift the debt ceiling in the summer of 2011. They set out a defined structure. This is how many people are going to be on it. It's going to be composed of members of both sides of the aisle. It's going to have a staff of professional, experienced people to come up with these recommendations, and they can do whatever they want. They can go above that target. They were technically supposed to achieve about $1.5 trillion in cuts, but if they went below $1.2 trillion, then it's going to be subject to those across the board cuts that known as sequester. And and there were calls at the time. A lot of people said, $1.5 trillion isn't good enough. We've got a massive debt problem on our hands. Of course, the debt was a lot smaller back then than it is now, but it was really in vogue back then to say, look, we've got to do something about this. We got to go big. And so, as you pointed out, Jason, Boehner and Obama were negotiating on this. They couldn't get it together because, frankly, the base on both sides of the aisle found out about what they were up to and said to Boehner, no, you're not raising taxes, not on our watch. And the left said to Obama, no, you're not cutting entitlements on our watch. So then it falls to the super committee. And, for people who were around back then watching this, it had fits and starts. I mean, they held hearings. They drafted proposals. They got them scored by the Congressional Budget Office and the Joint Committee on Taxation. They came close on a couple of things. The Democrats, definitely offered up some substantial cuts to entitlement programs, and they were willing to go there. And my understanding, the Republicans were too. They were willing to offer up revenue to go there, not as much as the Democrats would have liked, but certainly more than they were historically willing to part with. And the rest was history. We all know what happened. They could not get the votes to come through because of those very issues. The left and the right could not meet in the middle, and they could not come up with that formula to either go big to get something like $4 trillion in deficit savings, or even the bare minimum. They could not come up with that. So we were left with this across the board sequester, which Congress has spent the better part of the next decade or so kind of, turning off.
Deflating. Yeah.
Deflating.
No, yeah. I think that's important to note too, that there was they had the will of both chambers. Again, divided government. They had a Republican speaker and a Democratic Senate majority leader. They had the buy-in from them. They had the buy-in from the president to do this. And if they didn't get voted, if they didn't approve recommendations to forward to Congress by November 23rd, then it triggered, this sequester. And starting a year out in January of 2013, they cut $1.2 trillion sort of across the board, exempting entitlements and defense, like veterans benefits, things like that. But discretionary spending on defense, on a lot of popular programs was all fair game. And even knowing that they would have this automatic penalty to contend with, which, as you said, they've spent the better part of the last decade deflating, except for things around the Capitol, all the doors still aren't open, because the one thing that they were fine with cutting was basic services to the Capitol.
Yeah, I mean, one important point about that is they also knew that they had that November 21st, 2011 deadline, but they also knew the cuts weren't actually going to trigger for over a year. They weren't going to trigger until the beginning of 2013. So they thought to themselves, well, we've got another year to tackle this if we need to. So what happened? Boehner and Obama got back together and tried for another grand bargain. It fell victim to the same familiar problems on both sides of the aisle. And, what happened at the end of the day, they were left with all of the Bush tax cuts expiring at the end of 2012 And I remember this because Obama won fairly big in the 2012 elections, and he came back, and then Boehner went back to him and said, okay, let's do things your way. Let's go a little bigger on taxes, but you got to give me some of these spending cuts. And at that point, Obama said to Boehner, I'm sorry, you had your chance. I'm going to get my tax increases for free now without giving you anything. And they ended up doing, it was a smaller tax increase than I think a lot of the Democrats wanted, because if you recall, now President Biden, who was vice president then, went and cut a deal with Mitch McConnell over New Year's weekend, basically in 2012.
I remember it was New Year's Eve, the fiscal cliff we were heading off of, and I was sick as a dog, like monitoring this, from literally a sick bed.
I was at a New Year's Eve party with a glass of wine in my hand, trying to explain what was going on to people. But anyway, it was, and they delayed the cuts for a couple of months, but eventually they triggered, and they actually figured out that there's still some cuts that people don't really mind. It's some of these cuts they affect Medicare, they affect farm subsidies, and a few other programs. Congress has kept extending those cuts out into the future because they figured out, they're not that bad, and we need them to offset other things that we're doing. So anyway,
this is why it's so maddeningly frustrating for members of Congress too, right? I mean, first of all, the problem is the scale of the scale of the deficit now is so great that even when you try to come up with stuff, you can't get there. We're now projecting $2 trillion annual deficits, right? I mean, over 10 years, that's $20 trillion in very round numbers. And so if they talk about cutting $2 trillion, it's over 10 years, or $2.5 trillion over 10 years, that would make some dent, but it's not nearly going to turn around the fiscal trajectory. So they're not even really tackling everything that would be required here. And even but even setting a broad goal of $2.5 trillion, as House Republicans did, to cut $2.5 trillion over 10 years, that's a tall lift. And the reason is, if you have to look at the numbers, but I mean, all discretionary programs amount to about $1.7 trillion, right? So that doesn't even, you could cut everything, basically, all the discretionary government programs, the FBI, the national parks, education, you name it, and you won't get there. You don't have $2 trillion. So you have to go to the mandatory programs. And once you talk about mandatory spending, you're talking, if you're talking Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, and we have Trump ruling out Social Security and Medicare cuts, and Republicans have been very careful right now to say, again, Speaker Mike Johnson said it just yesterday, he's not going to cut Medicare benefits. I mean, they may have some wiggle room. It may still be doable, some things. I mean, Medicaid is a target of Republicans, I think. They talk about imposing work requirements on Medicaid recipients. That means probably fewer people will qualify for Medicaid, and so you're going to be cutting health care to poor people, but you will bring costs down, right? There are some things they can do. Pete knows even better than I, maybe some other examples of things they might be able to do in this package.
They can cut Medicare. They just can't go after benefits.
Can't cut the benefits.
Raise the retirement age and things like that.
I mean,
there's reimbursement to providers.
It's just hard to, it's just going to be a real struggle to get to $2.5 trillion. That's the problem. I mean, and even if they can get there, it's not like we're going to notice some dramatic shift in deficits. I mean, yes, there'd be some improvement, but you still have a massive problem there.
Yeah. And I also want to point out, too, that the recommendations, if the super committee had followed through on them, would have been like they would have greased the skids for them. It would have been subject to an up or down vote in both chambers. So no filibuster, no amendments, just straight to the floor, take it or leave it, which is kind of some of the same language we're hearing with how big to go with the reconciliation package this year with Mike Johnson. But that's a podcast for another time. I'll leave that to you, our team here. But so everything, the stage was set. And also I do want to talk just a little bit. I don't want to totally go into the weeds, but I just want to read the roster of this committee, which is replete with very serious legislators and very like competent people. And one of my concerns about like the way that I see the Congress sort of degenerating a little bit is that they're out of practice in doing hard things and doing hard legislation. The people who are on this committee were not. So here the two co-chairs, Patty Murray, Democrat from Washington, just left her position as Senate President pro tem. She's President pro tem emerita, I think now. But she's the appropriations chair in the last Congress. She's a ranking member in the current one. Back then, she was still was a serious legislator, and she was paired with Representative Jeb Hensarling, who was at the time was the Republican conference chair. He was a Republican from Texas. Again, serious people, serious legislators heading this up. The House Democrats were Jim Clyburn, forever in leadership, Chris Van Hollen, who's now a senator, Javier Becerra, who's now the HHS secretary. The other House Republicans, Ways and Means Chairman Dave Camp, a Republican from Michigan, very serious tax writer. Fred Upton, who chaired the Energy and Commerce Committee, which had jurisdiction over, basically everything, right? Healthcare, energy, and so forth. Another serious, legislator. The other Senate Democrats, John Kerry, who ran for president and went on to be Secretary of State. Max Baucus, who was chairing the Finance Committee at the time, and then went on to be ambassador to China and is also an ultramarathoner or whatever. John Kyle, who was the minority whip and also a very serious man. He's typically been the person who has to shepherd tough nominees, up on even in his retirement, and an Arizona native. I note. Actually, he's from Nebraska, I believe, but he lived in Arizona long enough. We'll take him. Pat Toomey, again, another hardcore legislative type, worked in the financial sector for years before coming to, going from the House, in the private sector and then the Senate. And then Rob Portman, who had this reputation as being very much a wonk. He was OMB director at one point, U.S. trade representative. It was in House leadership. So these were serious people who had an expedited process and the buy-in of the White House and the Senate, and they couldn't get it done. So I have to say, I don't have a lot of hope for the Doge or anybody, even if there was another super committee here. That doesn't mean it can't happen, but like these are just hard things to do. And as you said, David, even if they were to cut $2 trillion, which is a lot of money, that doesn't even get them like very far at all. It's like just making the minimum payment on a very hefty credit card bill.
Right. And to your point, Jason, I mean, there are still serious people in Congress. I wouldn't want to suggest that, back then everybody was great and now we have a bunch of duds. I don't think so. I think there are still very serious people. Patty Murray is still here. A lot of the members you name there, some of them are still here, in fact. And there are other new people that are still serious. To me, the problem is really that the margins are so tight. The two parties are much more polarized even than they were back in 2011. And so the politics are more bitter, and there's no margin for error. There's no way they can, if Republicans try to do something on their own, are the votes going to be there? And you've got this incredibly divided Republican conference between these hardcore purists who won't be happy with anything unless the debt is eliminated. And then you've got moderates who are going to be fearful that if you really slash spending, they're going to pay the price back home in their districts that may not be eager to see massive cuts. So there's just no room there for enough of a consensus, I don't think, to make it happen. That doesn't mean people aren't serious or competent. It just means that it's just much harder now. I think the politics are much harder now, even than in 2011, and they couldn't do it in 2011.
Yeah, I think the obvious trade here is going to be dropping the debt limit out of this package and dropping the Doge brothers $2.5 trillion in cuts out of this package. And then
you're talking about the reconciliation package.
Out of reconciliation, right? Out of the one big, beautiful, powerful bill.
Yeah.
Debt limit.
There could be two bills. Who knows?
Yeah.
Maybe we'll use it to buy Greenland.
Right. Yeah, it still could be two bills, but debt limit would presumably squeeze into one of those. Right. And you've got Republicans who, in 2023, when Joe Biden cut the deal with Kevin McCarthy, the former speaker, on the debt limit, Republicans put forward a pretty conservative bill. I mean, they had a bill that was fairly heavy on spending cuts. They couldn't do a ton on, in the short time they had, but they had work requirements in there on some of these benefit programs like Medicaid, food stamps. There were some cuts in there. There were a lot of things that, centrists weren't really comfortable with, going after clean energy tax breaks and things like that. All that was in there. They lifted the debt limit. They still lost 4 Republicans, and the bill passed 217 to 215. So Mike Johnson has an even smaller margin this time around. And if you're going to go throwing in all these cuts in there with this giant kitchen sink bill, he's really at risk of losing, a couple, 3, 4, 5 votes on the House floor. So where's Donald Trump? Donald Trump has been out there very vocally saying he wants a debt limit, possibly even eliminate. Just get rid of that requirement. And if you can, do it before I even take office, so I don't have to be the one, signing it. So you have Donald Trump, who's on record saying, just deal with the debt limit, get rid of it. I don't care if there are cuts as part of it or not. And then you've got a very, a sizable faction of House conservatives saying, no. If we're going to do anything on the debt limit, we got to have huge cuts. So can that get through the Senate with huge cuts? I don't know. Can it even get through the House? I'm not sure either. So what can you see?
Remember to that point that just last month they tried to suspend the debt limit as part of the big stopgap funding measure because Trump overturned everything they were doing and wanted the debt limit taken care of then, and 38 House Republicans bucked him.
Yeah. Well, there were no cuts in that bill. So
that's right. There were no offsetting cuts.
So what you could see is they end up dropping debt limit out of this one bill or 2 bills, whatever you want to call it, beautiful and powerful. Maybe one's beautiful and the other one's powerful. I don't know. But anyway, you can see him drop out. You can see Trump make a deal with the Democratic leadership on something, maybe raise the debt limit, suspend the debt limit for 4 years or even eliminate it, and then that's tied to some other piece of legislation. They got to get spending caps at some point for the appropriations process. That's what they've done multiple times, 3 or 4 times over the last decade. They've had deals that set spending caps for appropriations for 2 years and raise the debt limit. And then anything else that needs to be attached at the time goes in that package too. So you could have, a partisan reconciliation bill, and then you could have kind of a sidecar that's a bipartisan deal that gets 60 votes in the Senate, and you get Democratic vote support in the House. But then, of course, there's the threat hanging over Mike Johnson's head that if 9 Republicans, sign on to a motion to oust him, then, he's at risk. So it's all the same typical issues. John Boehner faced all these issues. Paul Ryan after him faced these issues. Kevin McCarthy very famously faced these issues and did not survive them. So, here we are. We're right back in it. We've been here before. We'll be here again. And
time is a flat circle.
We're going to be watching closely. Yeah.
All right. I hope we didn't overwhelm too much with our mixing and matching of Doge and super committee history and so forth. But I think that it does illustrate a good point, which is that this is incredibly hard. This is going to be incredibly hard, regardless of what kind of solutions that they come up with. Nothing will be a given. There are no easy routes, to out of the what they've constructed for themselves going into this year. So, Pete, David, thank you so much for talking about this. I know that this is our first time as a combined budget tracker, CQ budget podcast, political theater podcast. I feel very good about it. I feel like it's like the reconciliation package. It's big and beautiful.
And Moneyball ties it all together.
Right. All right. And then we're going to do something a little different for our listeners out there. Once a scribe, always a scribe. I can say that, which is a new feature, new year, new feature here for political theater. And that's our word of the week. People on Capitol Hill and in politics and campaigns throw around a lot of jargon. And we like to demystify some of that jargon and point out some of the cool idiosyncrasies of the world we inhabit. Pete and David, please stick around because I think that you'll find this interesting, or at least I hope. Who knows? So the word of the week is tellers. the term tellers may have noticed it in the ether in political coverage, particularly on Monday during the certification of the Electoral College count. The Electoral College Act, I'm reading from CRS report here, requires the appointment of tellers who read, record, and count the votes of each state and the District of Columbia. The law directs the President of the Senate then to announce whether any candidates have received the required majority, which announcement shall be deemed a sufficient declaration of the persons of any elected president and vice president. So that happened on Monday. The tellers, which is typically the leadership of the House Administration Committee and the Senate Rules and Administration Committee, they act as tellers when people announce the votes from their different states. The act provides that the tellers read each certificate. The president of the Senate then calls for any objections, and then here we go. There were no objections. The electoral count was certified. But I also want to point out a little bit of the history of this term teller, because it's not just in terms of the Electoral College. For that, you can see this on YouTube. But sorry, listeners, if you're not, which is Congressional Quarterly's American Congressional Dictionary, which I always have at my bedside. A teller in the dictionary, CQ dictionary, is an antiquated term for a member or clerk who counts members in certain voting or quorum call situations. Next thing is the teller vote, because it's C, quorum call or teller vote, a voting procedure formerly used in the House in which members cast their votes by passing through the center aisle to be counted but not recorded by name by a member from each party appointed by the chair. Members voting aye were counted first, followed by those members voting no, after which the counting members reported their totals to the chair. The House deleted the procedure from its rules in 1993, but during floor discussion of the deletion, a leading member stated that a teller vote would still be available in the event of a breakdown of the House's electronic voting system. I think what's fascinating to this is that up until 1993, you conceivably had a voting procedure in the House that was anonymous. You didn't actually have to go on record as being in favor or opposed to a bill that was then passed or did not pass. So maybe this could have come in really handy with some of the stuff that we're talking about, some of these tough votes. So that is the word of the week: tellers and teller votes. I hope everybody enjoyed that, and we'll be rolling out a couple more features. But I wanted to get word of the week out there in the open. I don't know if that had come up. If anybody, I frequently am queried by different people who are saying, what does this mean? You know, am I like my old man coffee group at Eastern Market in the mornings? My friends, some of whom worked in Congress or worked as staffers and so forth in different apparatuses, will say, like, what is this? What is going on? I figured this is a good spot for some of those terms. Those what is going on here term. Pete and David, thank you for being a part of this new feature and, of course, a part of this podcast. Thank you to our listeners for sticking with us. More than 300 plus episodes of Political Theater are now in the can, and we'll see you back next week.